So you guys know that China's getting smarter, right? This is the real threat that the United States has to deal with over the next decade, not a renewed Chinese hypergrowth or Chinese threats to Taiwan. And the United States is doing nothing about it. Like, China's getting smarter diplomatically, and the United States is getting actively dumber. This has been a dynamic that I've been talking about all year, but I feel like in the past couple months, it's gone into overdrive. The days when everybody assumed China's economy would just rampage past the United States economy have long passed. But there is a lot more to geopolitical competition than just economic growth. There are tons of domains to compete in, and China has reached a level of economic development where it's beginning to be able to compete in all of those domains. That doesn't necessarily mean China will be good at competing. In fact, we have two fairly recent examples where China failed pretty miserably. Donald Trump was an unmitigated disaster for China, which really surprised me, because the U.S.'s choice to elect an unbalanced, incompetent reality TV show as president was China's biggest opportunity since Pearl Harbor. In 1941, Japan had been attacking China for decades and had been engaged in a full-on attempt at conquest since 1937. In one of history's greatest blunders, Japan then decided to attack the United States. This gave China a massive ally that freed China by smashing Japan's empire and set up a world order where China was given great privileges, from the UN Security Council seat to the World Trade Organization. In the second Obama administration, the United States finally did what it had been talking about doing for a decade or so and pivoted to Asia, undermining China in every way we could, from the TPP to rearming China to setting up a new client state in Burma. China's growth miracle was sputtering out, and things looked dire. But then U.S. voters gave China the gift of Donald Trump. The charismatic, eloquent, non-white heartthrob was replaced by Soviet central casting's stereotype of a fat, incompetent, fail-son capitalist slob. What was even better for China is that instead of crafting alliances that could quietly smother them, Trump seemed to want to burn down the U.S. alliance structure and alienate everyone by dismantling global capitalism. All China had to do to win in 2017 was look like the sensible adults who wanted to keep the world the way it was. They just had to stick up for the status quo. China had a really simple job, and they failed at it completely. Xi started out well, going to Davos in January 2017, the month Trump became U.S. president. He claimed he would defend globalization and world trade. I was terrified by what this meant for the world order and U.S. primacy. Thankfully, or maybe sadly, depending on your perspective, that was the last intelligent thing China did during the Trump administration. They started reacting to Trump's infantile threats by falling down to his level. Maybe there was no avoiding the nationalist demands of the Chinese public, but whatever the reason, China's adoption of wolf warrior diplomacy was a disastrous mistake. The name itself is pretty horrifying. Wolf Warrior is a successful franchise of Chinese action films. How happy would you be if the U.S. State Department started talking about its John Wick diplomacy? What it meant in practice was China trying to play Trump's own game of petty grievance and bullying. When the U.S. used the world legal system we control to use Canada to attack a Chinese company, China played into our hands and arrested a couple of random Canadians. Maybe making the Chinese public happy, but alienating everybody else in the world. Xi Jinping and his Communist Party overreacted to Trump's rhetoric by killing the golden goose in Hong Kong and horrifically persecuting the Uyghurs of Xinjiang. These two fundamentally stupid and cowardly policies made it easy to portray China as evil on the world stage. And they were also completely unnecessary. Neither Hong Kong nor the Uyghurs presented any kind of real threat to Communist Party rule. With COVID, things got even worse. Whether or not the disease came out of a Chinese lab, as more and more seem to believe, the Chinese government cover-up at the beginning of the pandemic was incredibly irresponsible and would have been a serious international problem for China if Donald Trump's colossal mismanagement of the global pandemic wasn't so much worse and so much louder. Xi Jinping briefly got some credit from the Chinese people for doing such a good job stopping the spread within his own country, but this ended up being just another illustration of Chinese weakness. Competent countries with functioning healthcare systems, from Australia to China, eventually had to give up and let the disease in because of Trump's gleeful superspreading. Chinese competence proved to be meaningless if the United States decided something wasn't worth pursuing as a world priority. So back in the 2000s and as late as 2017, I was very intimidated by China, and I saw them as a real threat to U.S. hegemony. But after the 4 years of the Trump experience and the realization that China had somehow come out of that period looking worse than the Orange Monster, I stopped worrying about Chinese threats to U.S. hegemony. I am still not worried. When the U.S. empire falls, it will be because of the stupidity of U.S. leadership and policies, not because of anything China does. But over the past year or so, I have noticed that China has finally stopped furiously punching itself in the dick. China will never be a serious rival to the United States before it ditches Xi Jinping and probably the Communist Party as well. But over the past few months, it has started to put some of the building blocks of a saner reputation into place. What people fail to recognize is that China is incredibly new at this. Yes, China is an ancient civilization, 5,000 years of history, whatever. But in the context of an industrialized world, a modernized world where China is a great power, that's like a decade-old phenomenon, if that. The amount of economic growth that they've gone through have taken China over my lifetime, over my adulthood, from a minor player on the world stage to a major player on a world stage. And it's a world stage that they've never been a big player on in a technologically enabled industrialized fashion. So really, the Chinese political and diplomatic establishment are kind of like adolescents. And like any adolescent, the amount of development that China is going to go through over the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years is going to be extraordinary. Again, it's not a threat of economic growth. It's a threat of incredible development in political and diplomatic sophistication. China is going to get better and is getting much better at selling itself to the world. And the United States is not at all prepared for this. What China needs to do to capitalize on the U.S.'s never-ending series of mistakes is to present itself as a competent leader, not as the whiny bully that it chose to portray itself as throughout the Trump administration. Over the past few months, I believe that China is beginning to do that. The biggest example of this has got to be the electric car explosion. This has been going on in the background for some time, but spring 2024, it seems to be the point at which we all realize that China is kicking our asses at the electric car game. You can certainly argue that this is all hype, and no doubt some of it is. I doubt that BYD really has a car that will go 12,000 miles on a single charge and just cost $14,000. But even if it only goes twice as far for half the price of the Tesla Model 3, instead of 3 times as far at a third of the price, it's still a scarily massive improvement. I have a lot of friends in the U.S. car industry, and they freely admit that we have gotten our asses kicked, and the U.S. car industry's only hope is to hide behind Trump and Biden's growing tariff wall.
If we really do want to electrify everything, that doesn't just mean EVs, that means the entire system that feeds into the EVs. We need twice as much copper and 4 times as much chromium and 4 times as much nickel and 10 times as much lithium and so on. We have never, ever, in any decade in human history, doubled the amount of a mainline material production in 10 years, ever. And we need all of this by 2030? No. It's just not technically possible.
I guess you can keep listening to oil industry shills like Peter Zeihan, who are still frantically shouting that it's impossible to build a cheap, useful electric car. The rest of the world is paying more attention to China that appears to be actually building those cars. And the world has now started paying for those cars as well. In late May, we got even more surprising news from the World's Workshop. Energy analysts started talking about the possibility that China's carbon emissions may have peaked, which would be incredibly good news for the planet. Whether or not that's actually true, the fact that people are talking about it is a huge victory for China, and much earlier than anybody expected it. Carbon emissions peaked in the United States all the way back in 2009, but for decades now, we have been using the excuse of China's dirty manufacturing build-out to explain why we weren't doing more about climate change. China all of a sudden turning the tables on us and looking like, whether or not they actually are, looking like the climate leader is a very smart move. Unfortunately, this isn't the only rapid reversal we have seen in the battle of ideas. The new Cold War is nowhere near as ideological as the old one was, the one between the United States and the Soviet Union. China is nominally communist, but is largely content to play by the rules of the capitalist game, as set out by the United States. Across the past 2 decades, there was one serious ideological difference between the two countries, though. When sovereignty and human rights collided, China would stand up for sovereignty and the rights of governments to set their own paths, and the United States would unleash one mass death event after another in the name of preserving human rights. Until 2022, pretty much everyone outside of the domestic U.S. media environment could see that China was clearly winning this argument. U.S. human rights crusades in Syria, Libya, Iraq, South Sudan, and other places had killed millions. But then all of a sudden, in 2022, Russia's invasion of Ukraine changed everything. Now it was China that looked like the big hypocrite. For once, it wasn't the U.S. carrying out a mega-death forever war. It was a Chinese ally who Xi Jinping had just declared a no-limits friendship with. True, China wasn't helping Russia as much as Putin wanted, but they weren't really condemning the invasion either. Where were all of China's pro-sovereignty, anti-invasion principles now that Russia was doing it? Unlike the United States, Russia is a country that really cares what China has to say, and Xi Jinping hasn't used that influence in any serious way. For the first time this century, somebody else was the violent aggressor. This was an amazing opportunity for us to change the narrative and be the good guys we'd always claimed to be. And what have we done with it? Well, we've murdered tens of thousands of women and children in Gaza. What makes it even worse is that China is doing what we should have done after the invasion of Ukraine. This is how they are getting smarter. With Trump, they reacted to colossal U.S. failure by rushing down to our level. Now they are using the utter debasement of the U.S.'s human rights record to try to launder their own reputation, with some success. It proves absolutely nothing, of course, but on June 5th, the Chinese invited Turkish Foreign Minister Hakan Fidan to tour the capital of Xinjiang province. The Turks are the traditional protectors of China's Uyghur population, with whom they share a Turkic heritage. As China has gotten richer, and Turkey has gotten more and more economically interweaved with China, that protection has meant less and less. But regardless, while international news is filled every day with reports of U.S.-sponsored atrocity, China is inviting a Turkish delegation into the Turkic province that they are accused of genociding. That contrast is very intentional, and it is very smart. It seems like China is finally learning how to do effective diplomacy. Maybe the United States should try to learn that too. Thanks for watching. Please like, subscribe, and let me know what you think in the comments.